Chapter 5. Dr. Jekyll's Home. The lawyer stood for a while by the door. He looked very uncomfortable. As he walked slowly away, he was lost in thought. "God bless me," Utterson said to himself. He seemed barely human. Utterson continued around the corner to the other side of the block. Most of the buildings on the street were divided up into apartments or offices. At one time this neighborhood had been home to large wealthy families. Many of these families had owned entire buildings. Only one house still had a single owner. That was the second house from the corner. It was the last to show signs of wealth and comfort. The front door was newly painted, the knocker polished and shiny. All the other buildings had dirty windows and broken gates, but this building was well taken care of and clean. Utterson climbed its front steps and knocked. A well-dressed butler answered the door. "Is Dr. Jekyll at home, Poole?" asked the lawyer. "I will see Mr. Utterson," Poole said. The butler let Mr. Utterson inside and then went to look for his master. Utterson waited in a large, comfortable room warmed by a bright, open fire. This was one of the lawyer's favorite places in all of London. The room was decorated in dark, rich colors. The drapes were made of deep red velvet. The floors were covered in hand-woven Persian rugs. The walls were lined with expensive artwork and well-stocked bookshelves. He and Jekyll had spent many evenings here in quiet, enjoyable conversation. Utterson's mood that night, however, was neither welcoming nor warm. He could not forget the face of the monster, Mr. Hyde. Poole returned with the news that Dr. Jekyll was not at home. "I'm afraid I don't know when he will return, sir," Poole said. "He may be out for the rest of the night." "I saw Mr. Hyde entering this building from around the corner, Poole, through the door by the old laboratory," Utterson said. "Is that a good idea when Dr. Jekyll is away from home?" "Mr. Hyde has a key," the servant replied. "Your master seems to place a great deal of trust in Mr. Hyde," the lawyer said. "Yes, sir, he does indeed," said Poole. "We all have orders to obey him. Although we see very little of Mr. Hyde on this side of the house, he mostly comes and goes by the laboratory. Dr. Jekyll had bought the house many, many years before from another doctor. The previous owner had built a laboratory in the back of the house. The lab was a large room with high ceilings. Shelves and cabinets lined the walls. There were no windows in the room, only lamps and lanterns along the walls. There was an office above the lab where Dr. Jekyll could sit and work quietly. The office was much more welcoming than the lab. It had a fireplace, some comfortable chairs, and a window facing the main house. There was a courtyard separating the two buildings. Dr. Jekyll had not changed a thing in the lab. It was the main reason he bought the house. The cabinets and equipment were almost antiques, but Jekyll liked them. He often spoke about his desire to surround himself with beautiful things. It was important at home and at work. "Well, thank you for your time, Poole," Utterson said. He wondered what Poole really thought of Mr. Hyde. The butler was always very polite. He would certainly never say anything bad about Dr. Jekyll. Utterson knew that Poole was very loyal to his master. As a matter of fact, all of Jekyll's servants were very loyal to him. He was considered a kind and fair man by all who met him. "Please tell Dr. Jekyll that I stopped by." "Of course, sir," Poole said. The butler saw Mr. Utterson through the front door. There was a cool wind. Utterson held on to his hat with one hand while he walked along the street. He was deep in thought. The lawyer was familiar with the less desirable members of society, because many were his clients. He was aware of crime in the city and criminals who committed the acts, but he was very careful never to bring them into his life. His work was his work, and he did not let it affect his personal life. He could never imagine bringing a criminal into his home. Utterson could not understand why Jekyll would let this dangerous man into his house. Perhaps his friend did not know about Hyde running down the little girl. Maybe Jekyll did not realize the danger he was in. Sadly, Utterson knew that this was not true. He knew in his heart that Jekyll was well aware of Hyde's unlawful activities. By this time the lawyer was very worried about his old friend and his connection to Mr. Hyde. It must be the ghost of some old sin that holds Jekyll prisoner. Why else would he deal with the likes of Mr. Hyde? Jekyll's family was very wealthy. He had always lived a life of luxury. Despite his studies and experiments, he only worked because he enjoyed the science. Utterson wondered about his own youth, if there was anything he might want hidden. He could think of nothing that would bring him to such shame or fault. Utterson also worried that if Hyde knew of Jekyll's will, that he was to inherit all of the doctor's great wealth, he might want to do something to speed up the process. If only Jekyll would let me help. Utterson shook his head. This mystery was far from being solved.